Greetings, everyone. I'm Stephen Donaco, and thank you for joining us at this second and final roundtable in the Building the New World 2020 conference. The theme of tonight's roundtable is Possible World, based on the keynote address delivered by David Korten at the beginning of the conference. And thankfully, David is here to help me guide tonight's discussion. So let me just hand it over to David very quickly for a brief overview statement. So David.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. As Stephen has noted, this is the final discussion in the Building the New World Summit hosted by Laura George and the Oracle Institute. Now, our session theme is Possible World. Specifically, the world it is within our means to create together, if we so choose, a new civilization, an ecological civilization of material sufficiency and spiritual abundance for all. Possible World was the keynote presentation with which I opened the summit. And we approach this topic with the sobering recognition that scientists have marked the decade of the 2020s as a defining moment for humanity. By 2030, just 10 years from now, we must have achieved a 45% reduction in carbon emissions or risk triggering irrecoverable collapse of critical natural systems. The COVID-19 pandemic is simply one early example of the consequences of the human disruption of the natural regenerative systems of the living earth now playing out. The human species is on a path to potential self-extinction. Though specific interpretations may differ significantly, people across the political spectrum recognize that we are in deep crisis with little sense of our way out. Fear of the future is nearly universal. Political demagogues build on this fear to advance their agendas by turning us against one another. The result drives us into ever deeper conflict that blocks essential discussion of the causes of our existential crisis and the potential pathways to the alternative future it is within our means to create together. And herein lies the key. What we now must do can only be done together through partnership. And I assume that many of you heard the keynote by Riane Eisler on our human choice between domination and partnership as our primary mode of organizing as families, communities, and a now global civilization. Riane is a longtime friend and colleague. Her framing of the choice between domination and partnership was the foundational frame of my book, The Great Turning from Empire to Earth Community, published back in 2006. That theme continues as the foundational frame of most everything I have done since in search of a human pathway from the imperial civilization that still holds us in its thrall to the ecological civilization to which we must now transition. Now, for most of the 200,000 years that modern humans have inhabited the earth, partnership was our dominant mode of organizing. The caring relationships of partnership define our fundamental humanity, as some of you were discussing with Riane yesterday. Then, some 5,000 years ago, we humans turned away from the caring relationships of partnership and began to organize as imperial civilizations in which the few dominated and exploited the many in the earth. The competition for power helped to drive extraordinary advances in scientific understanding, but it also brought enormous social and environmental devastation, leading to our current existential crisis. I summarized many of the foundational causes of this monumental human failure in my opening keynote. We need not repeat them here. We have since heard from a host of thoughtful experts contributing their insights into our path to a possible world. So, survival of the human species depends on our coming to terms with our ultimate dependence on the ways Earth's great variety of living beings self-organize together to create and maintain the continuous regeneration of Earth's air, water, soils, and climate on which our existence and well-being depend. Our disruption of nature has disrupted these processes in ways that now threaten Earth itself. The details are extremely complex. The essentials are quite simple. We must learn to meet our human needs in ways that support the healing of Earth's essential regenerative systems. The defining assumption of our session this evening is that it is within our means to transform our choices in terms of human culture, human institutions, human technology, and human infrastructure in ways that meet the essential needs of all people while healing Earth and doing it in ways that are spiritually fulfilling. We have already heard from each of today's panelists in the areas of their specialization in previous summit sessions. Each brings to this session insights from their distinctive work into what we must now do together to create the possible world on which our common future depends. We are now in an existential crisis because of ways in which we got our cultural values wrong, our institutions wrong, our technologies wrong, and our infrastructure wrong. It is our great fortune that each of our expert panelists in this session specialize in one of these essential topics. Ruth Broyden-Sharon has a special interest in interfaith engagement and dialogue relating to foundational cultural values. One of our gravest errors has been to organize contemporary societies as if well-being depends on converting life into money. Perhaps Ruth can help us think about how we might address this issue through interfaith dialogue. Ellen Brown has a special interest in the institutions of finance to which contemporary society turns to create the money that finances our current money-dependent economy. Here we are in trouble because we have given private banks control of the money creation function to grow the fortunes of billionaires on the false assumption that somehow this will be beneficial to people and Earth. Ellen is perhaps the leading national authority on the use of public banking to regain public control of the money creation function and to use it in ways that enhance human and planetary well-being. Jerome Glenn is one of the nation's most distinguished experts in choosing technologies consistent with the needs of the possible world. We are in trouble because we so often give priority to technologies developed to extract natural wealth and to control and suppress Earth's living regenerative systems. I must note here that Jerome and I used to work together in the foreign aid system with USAID. And Jerome's going to help us tonight think about the ways in which different technology choices can better meet our needs while advancing the healing of nature. Peter Lombardi is world-renowned architect who specializes in what he calls the intentional community of today, featuring built infrastructure that merges wellness, clean energy, sustainability, vibrant community, environmental learning, organic farming, clean water, and local economies. Now, that's quite an agenda. It is an essential alternative to conventional architecture that burdens us with infrastructure that is automobile dependent while separating people from one another and nature, placing intolerable burdens on natural resources and systems. Then we come to Paul Chappell. Paul is in a class by himself. I would characterize him as an extraordinary student of what it means to be human. The foundation of his work is his thesis that which destroys the soul strips us of our humanity. Thus it is that those aspects of our culture, institutions, technology, and infrastructure that destroys the soul strip us of humanity. The challenge of our time is to reclaim both our soul and our humanity, through this vast menu of actions we must now take. So we have a lot to discuss as we pull together the elements of the possible world it is now ours to bring forth. And hopefully we can advance a part of that conversation this evening. Stephen, so back over to you.
Great. Thank you, David. Much appreciate that summary of your keynote and then the deeper introductions of each of the panelists. So in last night's roundtable, which was titled with the theme, Nurturing Our Humanity, There were several points of consensus among the panelists from which we can create a bridge to the topics we'll discuss tonight. So these points, and I'll mention three of them, included first, education. Education must evolve to teach our children stories that emphasize power with relating and a new social contract based in unity and diversity in order for humanity to transcend domination as the model that has been institutionalized across so many of our systems. Two, due to the immense complexity of our systems, we must embrace both a willingness to courageously experiment, plus be clear about our goals, not least of which we are creating or recreating systems guided by caring values. And then three, in every sector, whether governance, environment, education, health, etc., and at every level, whether local, intermediate, or global, we must practice a whole earth ethic to creating a caring economics of partnerism that has equal regard for people and for nature. So with that, we're going to move into our first round discussion. We'll have 3 rounds of discussion, and if you have questions, if you're watching, you can submit those questions into one of the social streams in Facebook or YouTube, and then I'll keep an eye on those as we go through the discussion and bring those questions in as appropriate. So the theme of our first round discussion is what's urgent over what's important and how we choose to act. So current world crises such as the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, and the rise of autocracies have exposed the cracks in many of our systems to expose their fragility. We all understand deep change is essential for human future to flourish. However, for that future to be possible, must the velocity of the change match the breadth of the crises? That is, do we even have time for incremental change, or do the depth and speed of the crises demand exponentially faster action, even if we make some mistakes along the way? So, Jerry, I'd like to actually start off by handing it to you for your take on those questions from your perspective.
Oh, okay. On speed, some of you may know I wrote about climate change with Barbara Hubbard in 1973 and global warming. I would have been surprised then that we'd be still actually wondering about what we're supposed to do. I think the climate change situation is not so much we don't know what to do, as we have so many things to do. There's not coherence. One of the things that I would like to add into the conversation, which I think is dangerously left out, is food. If you do cost-benefit analysis, when it comes to climate change and speed that you're talking about, you got to throw in the third factor of time. What is the cost, effect, and time to impact? The time to impact of changing the fleet of cars on average is about 17 years. Doesn't mean it can't be stated up. It's just that's what the data is, 17 years. So if everybody bought an electric car today, you wouldn't have the full impact until 17 years, and then impact after that, because then that's reduction of greenhouse gases going in. And the same thing with the energy systems in general. That takes time. No matter how fast you go, it's still time. But in my judgment, the fastest time to impact is changing the meat diet. Go from, we can make meat. We know now how to make meat without growing an animal. We know how to make meat-like products from vegetables. Beyond Meat and all these different things are taking off in the stock market, and it's growing. And I think that you can change the food consumption for impact on climate change faster than you can with energy and transportation. Now, if you look at agricultural, FAO did a study on this in 2006, by the way, David. 2006, FAO did a study on the transportation versus the meat industry. And it turns out the transportation industry has slightly less impact than the food, because the food industry, the majority of water we have today is fresh, goes to agriculture. Majority of that goes to growing animals that we hack out pieces of meat and we eat, all right? So the impact across the board isn't simply methane gas and farts and stuff like that. It's a whole system change. So, if you want to talk about speed and moving things very fast, then you go to a conference like this and someone's eating a meat dish, then you say, no, wait a minute. I mean, a friend of mine says, every time you go to these environmental conferences, how many of them are eating a hamburger? Majority of these people are still eating meat. Now you say, you like meat? Fair enough. Then, go on to the meat without animals, or the meat like with vegetables. You can still satisfy all those sort of nutritional requirements without screwing up the environment. So you want to talk about speed, that's one. A second one on speed is we now have the capability to create collective intelligence systems for the world, for a coherent, data-based, research-connected, global conversation that's coherent. We've got a trial balloon out there called the Global Futures Intelligence System. Hopefully Google or somebody else will do a far better job. But the ideas of creating collective intelligence are here now. The tools are here now. It's just because because it's pretty hard to ask people to cooperate if you don't have coherence in the conversation. I would say another one that's very fast on the agenda is, this is going to sound a little more far out, but it's going to have more impact faster, I think, than even climate change. And that is the move from artificial narrow intelligence to general. Quick. Narrow intelligence is what we have today. All right, that's machine learning, that's all that sort of stuff. It drives a car, diagnoses cancer, but the thing that diagnoses cancer can't drive a car, right? It's narrow. General intelligence we may never have, but we probably will. And we could have it even in 10 years, maybe 20 years. But between 10 to 20 years, I will take a bet that we'll have it. The reason I stress this is if we don't have the initial conditions right for going from narrow to general intelligence, then when it, and it probably will, evolve into superintelligence, that's the third category, it'll go beyond our control and understanding and not necessarily to our liking. That's what science fiction is warning about. Now, that's a disaster potentially in 20 years from now. We're screwing up the environment, but we won't disappear in 20 years. But the general intelligence going to super by mistake could actually give us more of a problem systematically worldwide than even climate change, right? So if you're looking at time speed, I'm just responding, Stephen, to your, I wasn't going to talk this way, but that's all right. This is fine. So we need an international governance system for the transition from narrow to general intelligence. And the sooner the better. It's going to take at least 10 years to get that done. I mean, you know, this conference, this meeting, and time's up. Yes.
All right.
Am I at the edge of my time? Probably.
No, that's great. Yeah. Thank you, Jared.
Okay. Really, all right. Well, those are a couple of things. We can talk about some more stuff later.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anybody want to respond to Jerome on that? And Paul, I know you. Why don't you go, Ruth, and then yeah, please.
Jerome, I want to go behind the curtain for a moment and not look at the technology and all the other things you mentioned, because those are very important, but they emanate out of another place that is essential that we have to consider now as we're building the new world. So Rabbi Mordechai Finley was once asked a question by one of the congregants about a very difficult situation. And he said to the rabbi, "What should I do?" And the rabbi said, "That's the wrong question. The right question is, who am I?" And if we don't answer that question properly, then all the things you talked about are not going to happen to our advantage. If we don't understand that we are now entering the age, in terms of the spiritual and religious communities and ecumenical dialogue, I have seen over 30 years, I've seen the movement go from introducing dialogue, learning about other people's religions, going deeper into our own religions, and then from the dialogue, suddenly everybody's saying dialogue is not enough. So what do we do next? Who are we? What do we care about? What are our values? The next move became the humanitarian move. And that had to do with ecology, with refugees, with immigrants, with debt, world debt. And so because it came from being a question about coexistence to pro-existence, from activism to pro-activism. But until we answer the question about the value of our humanity, about the value of each individual, about the necessity of our thinking of ourselves as part of a whole and operating as if whatever we do, everybody experiences, and what anybody else does is also ultimately absorbed by us. So I just want to remember as we go forward from all these different sectors that the main question is, who am I? Who are we? And starting from there, we'll have a better way to answer the questions, the very important questions that you proposed.
Great, thank you, Ruth. Paul. Oh, you're on mute there, Paul.
I just think, Jerome, you had so many incredible points, and especially about what we eat being the biggest and fastest way to affect the climate. I just don't hear that talked about enough, and thank you so much for bringing that up. You know, something that is within our means to affect in many ways that we don't even know about. And I just wanted to add something to another really important point you made about general artificial intelligence. Something I talk about is how humans have been dealing with pandemics for thousands of years. So the Iliad begins with a pandemic, and there's pandemics in the Bible. And pandemics are certainly serious problems and something that we have to work toward resolving. And humans have been dealing with autocratic rulers for thousands of years, right? In the Iliad, there's an autocratic ruler, Agamemnon. But when it comes to artificial general intelligence, I mean, humans have never dealt with this kind of problem before. And even with climate change, humans have never dealt with human-caused climate change and never with such a large population, but we have dealt with forest fires and other different effects in terms of how the environment around us has changed. But general artificial intelligence is something we've never dealt with before. It's unlocking this godlike power and a really serious potential threat. And I just want to add to that also, I think virtual reality and augmented reality are going to be huge issues. When Apple and Facebook are saying that augmented reality and virtual reality are going to replace smartphones and traditional computing with what they are calling spatial computing, or the next computing platform, the way that virtual reality and augmented reality could magnify human pathologies and magnify tangles of trauma that humans have if we are not properly ethically developed, or as Ruth was saying, if we don't know who we are, when VR and AR come along, if we don't know who we are as humans, the potential could be catastrophic. So again, just wanted to add to your really brilliant points.
I would like to add on top of the lovely things that Ruth had shared with us. You know, in my work, I do ask all the time, who am I? You know, what is the purpose behind these communities that I've been developing? And my purpose as an architect, or also, I guess, a visionary, is to create spaces that have people ask those questions as they're going throughout their day, in the gardens, on their way to back to their home, or picking up their children. And I would even go further and say that it's not just seeing how we're relating to ourselves, but also just to understand the sacredness of all life, you know, even down to the blade of grass. I think once we start to get into that consciousness shift, then, you know, that's also a huge sort of compression breakthrough on how we're going to get through all of what we're in right now.
Alan.
Thank you all for all that. For me, the issue is that the Dominator class is moving too fast. So we've got the World Economic Forum setting out this great reset that is covering everything. I mean, money and banking are my area, but it's covering a lot more than money and banking. It's covering agriculture and business and trade and virtually everything we're doing. And they've set it all out on this very complex website with the fourth industrial revolution and the Internet of Things, where everything will be attached to the Internet of Things, including us and our bank accounts. I mean, that's the part I'm a bit concerned about, like our money. And then you've got the International Monetary Fund talking about another Bretton Woods conference where we would redo the whole global financial system and the reserve system. And it looks like what they're thinking of is they're not too specific about what they're thinking about it, but it looks like they're thinking of the IMF as issuing a reserve currency, a digital currency, something like the SDRs, the special drawing rights that they do issue, but on a much bigger scale. And all central banks would be issuing central bank digital currencies, which has a lot of, actually all that has potential for good, but they have left out the democratic, you know, the personal, they've left out the Bill of Rights and all the things that we whole deer. And so somehow we have to capture that before the train runs away and captures us and imposes all these rules on us. So that would be my big concern on the speed, is how do we capture that? We can only do it by democracy and by, it seems to me, the first thing we need is to educate people, you know, to sort of awaken people to what the issues are here so everybody knows what we're facing. And then, well, in my field, of course, public banking, we've had several grassroots movements that have been very effective, where people have just gotten out and petitioned their local legislators and actually managed to get bills passed. So that's what we need to do. But first, we need to know what it is that we want to change or get passed, or, you know, what the threat is and how we can redo that in a way that it actually serves the public interest instead of exploiting people as we've had go on for a millennia now.
Could I just add one thing, Stephen? That Ellen made me think of it now. The Swiss theologian Hans Kuhn created what was called the global ethic, and he presented it in 1993 to the Parliament of the World's Religions in Chicago. And it seems what we're all worried about is that there will not be an agreed upon global ethic of how all these new changes are going to affect our lives. And whether it's banking, how money is distributed, or the things that Paul mentioned about virtual reality taking off at a place and not being able to control any of it. Or in San Francisco, there was a scientist who had figured out how he can remove DNA from someone's body and alter it so that they wouldn't have the weaknesses, the genealogical genetic weaknesses. And someone who went to interview him said, he was a young scientist, and he said to him, "Wow, you're just like God." And his answer was, "No, I am God." So this is the moment to really think about what are the ethics of what we're doing. It's not, okay, everything is speeding beyond even our conception of what it'll be, and it's faster than we know. But I think we actually have to stop for a moment and engage the world in creating some kind of document, Magna Carta, a new one for the 21st century, of what it is we're going to be doing with all the capacity that we have.
Yeah, and Ruth, you remind me, I mean, so, you know, Barbara Marx Hubbard said this back during the era of dropping the atomic bomb, is like, now we have the power of gods. So, you know, that as a theme is not just, you know, within the last few years, certainly. David, as we just get your response now that everybody's contributed in this section.
Wait, I'm sorry.
do you have anything you want to add now that everybody's had a chance to respond in this particular section of the conversation so far?
Yeah, I think the points that have been raised are extraordinarily foundational. You know, I mean, the task that we have to complete almost instantly, you know, by any logical analysis, is totally impossible given, you know, any analysis of human history. And yet it is absolutely essential. Now, one of the things that gives me hope in the midst of this, as I face that reality, is the distinctive nature of the human. And the fact that we live by our stories, by the frames that we develop in our minds. And, you know, one of the reasons we're in trouble now is because of the power of essentially a false economics that has taught us that making money is the purpose of the economy, and it is the foundation of wealth, ignoring the fact that it's just a number, and ignoring the fact that our very existence depends on the dynamics by which life itself organizes, and how it has learned to organize through the processes of evolution. and that it was not created for us, but at least as I think about the unfolding of creation, that we're creation's most daring experiment with the potential power of self-aware consciousness connected to the agency of our bodies. And that we're in trouble because we've gotten our stories wrong, but the stories are simply in our head. And that simply by, well, first of all, we have to get beyond the outmoded science idea that everything is material mechanism, because life cannot be explained by material mechanism. And we also have to change the story about money being the foundation of wealth. But if we can get into our minds that we are living beings and that living beings have this extraordinary capacity to self-organize as communities that create and maintain the conditions essential to their own existence. And it starts with our own bodies, but it goes all the way up to the living earth, and the way in which all of the living species interact together to create and maintain these regenerative systems on which we're absolutely dependent. So the foundation of it all, to me, is shifting that consciousness. And since there's no inherent barrier in nature or in reality, the only barrier is the story in our mind. That can be changed very rapidly. And we now have the communication tools to do that. And this webinar, which we're doing seated all around the world and coming together as if we're in the same room, is an example of the kind of technology that potentially allows us to make that shift very quickly.
Yeah, Jerry.
I agree that the narrative of the mind and the unconscious mind is like 150% important. Agreed. Now,
I didn't say the unconscious mind.
Well, I'm saying both. I'm saying both because I'm with Freud. Wasn't right about everything, but he wasn't wrong about everything. Unconscious mind is a big deal, especially on a global basis. Now, the unconscious mind during the 60s, 70s, and 80s believed that World War III was inevitable. Historians tell us that whenever two or more great powers confront each other, sooner or later, they use the weapons of the day and invent some along the way. Well, we didn't have World War III. According to the general consensus, I mean, I would go around and say, hey, how many people think going to do World War III back in those days? And most of the hands would go up. Yeah, it's inevitable. It's just the way it is. It's just inevitable. So you couldn't think through thermonuclear war. I mean, it was just so horrible. I don't want to deal with it. Well, we got through it. Now, that doesn't mean we can't still have problems about nuclear material. I'm not knocking that, but I'm simply saying it was a foregone conclusion. The narrative of the mind of humanity was World War III was inevitable. It was wrong. Second, and that's a reason to be optimistic, because if we can turn around the biggest trend in the history of civilization, that's a big deal. Second, as David is a witness to this, when I went running around the world hooking up internet stuff in the 80s, before people knew what the hell it was, we distributed the means of production before people knew they were the means of production. That's how I got away with it. And anyway, at that time, we thought all things great and glorious were going to come out of that activity. We didn't think about child pornography. We didn't think about, well, we thought a little bit about information warfare, but not too much. And we didn't think about all the horrible things that are associated with it, as well as the good stuff, but we didn't. We thought, hooking up computers, it's going to be great, it's wonderful. We went running around with a magic wand around the world thinking this is going to be fabulous. Now, today, we have another one, and that's the one that Paul picked up on, is the general intelligence. That's going to be another big deal, bigger than people realize, in the same way they didn't realize how big the internet was going to be either. I mean, believe it or not, David, when CARE took us over, they said, we don't need CareNet computer communications. We have a fax machine. They actually said that. We have a fax machine. We don't need this global system. Anyway, but that's the nonsense. It was gone. Now, we're facing the same ignorance today about general intelligence. But the difference is reason to be optimistic. As we speak, there are conferences about the ethical issues and the governance issues and the principles of general intelligence that was not there when we started with the internet. It was a race to get it done. That was the issue. Today, the issue is, oh my God, this could be a mess. Let's think about this. There's far more technological assessment of what principles humanity wants, what it's all about, by far than we had during the internet. So there's a real reason to be a little optimistic. So when you say some of these tasks are impossible, like, I don't know. We've already passed one impossible test on World War III.
So I'm going to take that as a segue to get to our next section, and we can actually continue this discussion as we get into the second round, because it's about innovation. So the general theme of this second round is innovations as a means of evolution over opportunism. And I'm just going to relate very quickly a story that I once heard. I don't know if it's true, but it sort of seems like it could be, that rural mail carriers in the horse and buggy days would actually spend a lot of time talking to the residents on their routes. And if that's true, we might say that there was a social purpose embedded in that function of delivering the mail, just to interact with people. However, once the automobile was invented, the mail carrier no longer had time to stop for chit chat, but only delivered the mail and went quickly on his way because he had a whole bunch of other things to do all of a sudden. So ever since, it seems that the original intention of each new technology, from the telephone to the television and the internet to social media, has been to bring people together. However, somewhere along the way, that social purpose gets corrupted and we become all the more divided or even isolated as a result. So Paul Chappell, I want to direct this next question initially to you. Your work with the Peace Literacy Institute is working in the evolution of social media to virtual reality to help ensure that the old divisive and dysfunctional pattern is not repeated in that domain. So what are the keys that will not only help, but ensure that humanity comes together around a generative manifestation of the possible world? And what is the missing piece or pieces that ensure the products of innovation contribute to evolution and service to humanity versus regressing to the old dysfunctional patterns that have been so efficient at dividing and enslaving us? So Paul. And you're on mute, Paul. You have to take yourself off mute.
Yeah, I can start by going back to a brilliant point that Ruth made about knowing who we are as humans. So if you think about a caterpillar just knows how to turn into a butterfly. Doesn't have to go to school, doesn't have to read a book, just knows how to turn into a butterfly. An oak tree just knows how to be an oak tree. Doesn't have to get an education to know how to be an oak tree. But more than any other species on the planet, humans, we have to learn how to be human. And the Roman philosopher Seneca and also psychologist Erich Fromm talk about the art of living, how the most difficult art form for humans is the art of living, more difficult than sculpting, painting, playing any sport, writing. And when the art of living is concerned, we are not just the artist, we are also the masterpiece. We are not just the sculptor, but also the sculpture. And when we aren't taught the art of living or how to be human, it is so easy to be out of tune with our humanity. So if we don't really understand our humanity, we don't know what our vulnerabilities are, people can very easily exploit those vulnerabilities that we are not aware of. And just to kind of offer how peace literacy ties into this, a metaphor, an analogy that I often use is, imagine if you had a basketball game and imagine if nobody was taught how to play basketball. It would be a mess, but nobody would be shocked or surprised. Nobody would feel despair about humanity. People would say, well, that's obvious. That's what you would expect to happen if people weren't taught how to play basketball. And what if you had an orchestra play Beethoven and nobody was taught how to play their instruments? It would be a mess. And again, nobody would be shocked or surprised. That's what you should expect to happen when people aren't taught how to play their instruments. So we live in a society, in a world where people are not taught the most basic peace skills. But we don't teach people in many cases the most basic peace skills, how to listen with empathy, many other peace skills involved with that. And not only are we not teaching people those peace skills, we're often teaching people the opposite of that. So many people actually learn the opposite from their parents or from the media of what would be conducive to building a more peaceful and just world. And I've been doing this work for over 20 years, but I've been doing this work full-time for over 10 years. And over the past 10 years, teachers would often say to me, high school, middle school, elementary school teachers, they would say, can you come to the school and can you give a 30-minute talk about peace? We'll get all the kids in the auditorium and can you do a 30-minute talk about peace? And we might do another 30-minute talk about peace next year. A teacher would never say, can you come to the school and can you do a 30-minute talk about algebra? And maybe next year we'll do another half an hour on algebra. Or can you do a 30-minute talk about geometry, or a 30-minute talk about grammar, or how to speak a foreign language? And we might do another half an hour next year. We realize in our society that literacy and math and reading and writing are competencies. And we have to view peace literacy as a competency that is even more complex than literacy in math and reading and writing. So what David was talking about, this is even more complex than literacy in math and reading and writing. There are no math equations for how to solve racism, sexism, extremism, polarization, right? Trauma, addiction, all these issues. And just to share one more last analogy, I know a peace studies professor, he also teaches middle school, and he told me that he showed a documentary about Martin Luther King Jr. to his middle school students. And his middle school students really liked this documentary about Martin Luther King Jr. and really liked it. And then he said they went to recess a few hours later and they went back to pushing each other around and being aggressive toward each other. And he said to me, he said, I don't understand how I could show this documentary about Martin Luther King Jr. to my students. And they really liked it. And then a few hours later, they went back to pushing each other around and being aggressive toward each other. And I said, well, it's like showing people a video of Michael Jordan playing basketball, and then you play basketball like Michael Jordan. We're not teaching people all the skills and capacities for how they can do that consistently in the midst of adversity. And where this really came together in my mind is I graduated from West Point. I was in the Army for 7 years. I left the Army as a captain in 2009. And the Army gives people such excellent training in how to wage war, such detailed training in how to wage war, right? The Army treats warfare as a art and as a science, as a discipline, as a profession. But people receive almost no training in how to wage peace. And not only are people not taught how to wage peace in our society, especially people are often taught the opposite of what is conducive to waging peace. So I think that if we change this pattern, if we realize, wait a minute, why are we shocked? If people weren't taught basketball or how to play an instrument, if people weren't taught engineering, we wouldn't be in despair. If people are not taught how to live as humans, how to be human, how to wage peace, and we're taught the opposite of that, why should we be shocked? Why should we be in despair?
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, Ruth.
That's so wonderful, Paul, that you said that. When I used to give public talks on interfaith dialogue and why it's so important, or interfaith activism, I would call myself the interfaith Pilates coach. And everybody would, open their eyes and wonder, what does Pilates have to do with interfaith activism? And I said, well, it's the same thing. You have to develop the muscle, just as what Paul was talking about. You develop a muscle, and the way you do it is through regular exercise. And I asked everybody, do you know what's the idea behind Pilates? What is the most important place that you have to relate to when you're doing this? And so everybody shouted out, you have to start from your core. That's the sort of the sine qua non of Pilates. You start from your core. Okay, I said the same thing in interfaith dialogue, in retraining yourself how to behave with other people. And then I would say, and if you go through an entire Pilates session and when you're finished, you haven't sweated and you haven't been uncomfortable, then you haven't actually performed the exercise properly. Because in order to know that we have actually done something of value, especially if it's exercise, we have to have sweated and we have to have been uncomfortable, not in pain, but uncomfortable. And so this is the same thing that what Paul is talking about is actually crucial to the next stage of keeping up with science, where people can be trained to develop the muscle, the humanitarian muscle. And it has to, and we don't teach parents either how to raise children. And we expect them to know we teach everything else, like you said, how to drive a car, you need a license, you need to be with a trainer, but we don't teach parents how to parent, and we don't teach people how to behave as better humans. We all know how we can be, but if we're not practicing that, and that's part of what the world of meditation hope to achieve, that through the art of perfecting, of learning how to meditate, that you actually engage parts of yourself that you don't normally do on a daily basis. You engage those spiritual parts of yourself, and in that process, you stretch yourself so that you can start to have the muscle to be able to behave better as a human being. A few years ago, we had it was called Seeds of Peace, And we had as our keynote speaker, Marianne Williamson. And she spoke about bridging the meditation with social action. And she said, if you're only meditating and not involved in social action, then you're not a total, complete human being. If you're only a social activist, but you're angry all the time, you're so passionate about your subject and what you want people to know, but you have no sense of how it is to quiet your mind and to introduce your subject peaceably, right? Then you haven't mastered it either. So what I think we need to do is we need to have parallel grooves operating now in our lives, where as we're going forward in silence, we are equally going forward in the expansion of consciousness, as David pointed out, and developing the muscles of what it takes to be a full human being. And I think we can do it. I believe we can do it. Paul, you're helping us.
No.
Yeah, Ellen, please.
I have one more muscle story. Wim Hof, who teaches breathing exercises, he says willpower is a muscle. That really helped me. Like if I'm out walking and I'm kind of tired and I think, no, you got to finish your walk. And I think willpower is a muscle, and then I keep going. But it seems to me, I mean, if we're talking about how we're going to turn this train around, this train wreck that we all see kind of approaching, I don't know if we have time to teach people those things. I mean, if we're talking about education, one thing I think they should never have dropped was civics. They don't teach civics anymore. That was one of my favorite courses in high school. And kids don't, I mean, you really have to understand how government works and how your government works and what you can do to have an impact on government. So that's one of the things I think that should go back in there. But what does it mean to be human? The difference between us and robots is creativity, I think, and empathy, the ability to relate to other people and to feel this sort of, communication, even not necessarily with words, but just being in a group or we're now learning to communicate on screen, which has definite disadvantages. Like we don't get to go to dinner and, all those things that you usually do at conferences. But you do get to do a lot more conferences from all over the world. Yes, last night I did one in Australia, which was quite cool. I did feel kind of invited into their atmosphere. So we do have to learn to adjust to these new tools that we have. But my concern is that the wrong powers will capture those tools and we won't be able to get them back. And that seems like the major issue. How do we recapture them? And particularly, even though money is not the crux of life, certainly if some overlord power has the power to turn our money off, we will definitely feel the effects. And it's definitely a control mechanism. And so it's a control mechanism we want to have in our own hands, the ability to do money fairly and to have access to whatever our own work and the ability to share and so forth.
Thank you, Ellen. Yeah, Paul.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Thank you, Ruth. You made so many excellent points. I just wanted to respond quickly. I really loved when you talked about our humanitarian muscle. And something I talk about is the muscles of our humanity and how empathy is like a muscle that we can make stronger and we can develop and strengthen. And it atrophies if we don't develop our muscle of empathy, and how conscience is like a muscle and curiosity is like a muscle. And appreciation and stewardship is like a muscle. And we are not taught, most people at least in our education system, how to develop and strengthen those muscles. And a lot of what people learn actually suppresses those muscles. And as Jerome was saying about the technology, if you think about our use of technology, the technology really becomes a problem when the muscles of our humanity are not developed, when our empathy, conscience, curiosity, appreciation, stewardship, et cetera, are not developed. When we don't know who we are as humans, when our humanity is not developed, that's when the technology becomes a really serious problem. And going back to artificial general intelligence and also virtual reality, augmented reality, the negative potential of those technologies for entities, for creatures, for beings that are not self-aware of who they are or have not developed themselves fully in their ethical capacity, it's really going to increase the urgency for all of this as the technology unfolds in the coming years. So I just love what you said, Ruth, about our humanitarian muscle and how so many of our problems result from that not being developed the way it should be. Thank you.
Now, I'll note that we've had many Indigenous people on this conference as well. And maybe perhaps another muscle is the muscle that it attunes us to what nature tells us. So, you know, Peter, looking at you when I'm thinking about this, because you work with, at least my interpretation of your work is that you're paying attention to what nature teaches us about innovation and how we innovate with nature and within nature.
Yeah, and I think what I would add to that is, you know, there's a complexity to nature and there's also a simplicity to nature. And I think a lot of the disconnects we have right now globally are due to being disconnected from nature. So I do see a lot of solutions. You know, when I go back in and study biophilic design, or, you know, how to create abundance through organic farming and buildings that support that kind of agriculture, it seems like all the answers sort of, you know, fall right into place. You know, Ellen, you were talking about, you know, money being handled in a way that is fair and equitable. And what I've been learning from this natural process is that what you want is redundancy, you know, so you want different ways of making your food, different ways of creating money or wealth, different ways of collecting your water and making your clean energy, because nature has a redundancy to it. And therefore, if one group is trying to start, you know, wanting to control you through dominance, you can then just slip over to this other system you have in place. So I know it's a little long-winded, but my point is, yes, by studying nature, there are just so many answers just waiting for us right there.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
I would love to live in an intentional community, but I live in the city. Now, what do we do?
Yeah, it's a
There's
little
no place to farm. We don't have any natural streams or anything.
Well, I do have a unit you can put in your kitchen. It looks like a refrigerator, but it's a grow shelf system. So you could be growing tomatoes and herbs and, you know, start to do things that way.
Vertical agriculture is beginning to get noticed. You can take sides of buildings and turn them into farms.
Mm-hmm.
You can take great atriums in the middle of buildings that were just sunlight. We'll put some green in for that sunlight. You do a Google search on vertical urban agriculture, you'll see that a lot of these little things are beginning to grow around the world. So it's not hopeless in dense cities. There's a lot of potential there.
Yeah, Paul, go ahead.
I just wanted to respond really quickly. And Ellen made a really great point that I didn't respond to about even willpower as being a kind of muscle. If we think about willpower in terms of focus and concentration, the ability to focus the mind and concentrate, and how important in today's world with so much distraction that we develop this ability, this muscle of discipline, focus, concentration. And just the simple act of giving another human being your full attention is so nurturing, just to give another human being your full attention, your full concentration. So I really liked when Ellen talked about that muscle and how important in today's era of so much potential distraction that we cultivate our muscle of focus and concentration and discipline.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. And I'm reminded of Susan Christensen's presentation before yesterday's roundtable, where she said one of the muscles, she didn't call it this, but I'll interpret it as that, is that one of the muscles that we can work on building is to listen to everyone as if they are the divine, and how challenging that can be, but also how necessary. There's a question that I want to bring up it's from Kurt Johnson, who was one of the panelists yesterday. I'm going to bring it on screen here. If it'll pop in, here it comes. So Kurt asks a question following on last night's conversation, from last night's roundtable, he means. Whether in the corporate board and CEO rooms or at the top echelons of the UN, that is where we often see the most pushback on how these values and ideals we all share here can enter these realms of policy and power from the embedded dominance hierarchies. Any clues from any of you regarding how we bridge those gaps between boardrooms and executive rooms? Yeah, Peter.
I would just love to speak quickly. You know, I've been studying the U.S. Constitution through Hillsdale College in Michigan. I'm doing an online course in that. And what I'm learning from the original Constitution, which I don't believe we're really living under anymore, although it could be updated. But what I'm seeing is that doing your part, being an empowered being, is the way to affect positive change. I don't really know that it's at these bigger, larger levels that's how the change is going to happen. I think the change happens individually and one by one at a grassroots level.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Yeah, Ruth.
I want to bring this back to what you mentioned earlier, Stephen, about the indigenous representation. So in the interfaith and spiritual communities, we now have many people from Native Americans and indigenous people from around the world who participate. At the beginning, they were just there to do ceremony. So it was like a, not really token, but it was a symbolic representation that we were including them, and we would thank the territory, the land that we were on, and so forth. But something really interesting has been happening in the interfaith community, and I think it's also true of the spiritual community. The Native American, the indigenous population has been telling us for 5,000 years about the importance of caring for the earth. They've never changed their melody. And we have not heard that melody until just recently, when because of what's happening to the earth and the destruction we see and the degradation and the rainforest, the lungs of the earth being cut so drastically. But in the communities where people of different faiths get together, the native population now has a prominent role that goes way beyond just doing opening ceremony. And at Religions for Peace, which was held in New York about, I think, 6 or 7 years ago, it was during the climate march. And they had people from all over the world and from all the different faiths, but they had some of the most significant representatives of the indigenous population giving workshops and speaking, not just doing ceremony. And so even at the UN, you see more people from that community having an opportunity to speak. They are our big brothers and sisters in this arena. If we can't listen to them and to their wisdom and understand that their connection to nature is not something that they learn, they inhabit it. It's learned through their parents, of course, but it's something that's part of their cosmology. And it's not something foreign or extra that they have to learn about. So if that means that people all over the world, the indigenous populations of the world, they know that. They have that in their veins. Their medicines are part of learning about the plants that they have around them. They know that. We lost that. So part of what I see having to happen, along with everything that Paul mentioned about developing the muscles, is that a new healthy respect and desire to learn about our connection through our brothers and sisters who are the perfect teachers. They've always been there. I want to listen to them.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I suspect you're going to move to the third round soon, Steve.
Yes.
And I want to pick up on what Ruth was saying and connect it to the discussion about education. You know, if you think about it, it's very striking that for most of the human experience, our children grew up in the community connected to the earth. So in every aspect of their lives, they were connected to earth and to the living human community, all of which involved relationships, interacting in the way life structures and interacts. And that basically, relationships are the foundation of life. Now, think about modern education. Think about the way we structure the lives of our children. And increasingly now, our home is a place where both genders, the husband and the wife, are both spending most of their time out running around between jobs trying to pull together enough money to keep the family alive and off the street. And our children are completely stripped of relationships to nature and even relationships to family, let alone the relationships to the larger community, organizing together, solving problems together, taking care of each other. And you think about that and how we all grow up. You know, it shouldn't be surprising that we're in deep trouble. You know, it's not just about school, but of course, the way we organize school, as many of you have pointed out, is also a deep part of the problem, that we spend more time on algebra than on things like civics or I assume that most of the biology is probably what I know is old biology, which is about grinding up cells and studying their chemical composition rather than studying how they engage in the exchange of energy, water, nutrition, and information to maintain living organisms. So this is another aspect of the depth of which we have to rethink our ways of living and organizing. I just want to comment briefly on the issue that Kurt raised about corporations and the leadership. One thing you've got to bear in mind is if you ever hear a story about an authentic leadership from a business in terms of true commitment to community and community well-being, you will find that it is owned either by an individual with a deep or controlled, the ownership is controlled by an individual with deep commitment, or it is some kind of cooperative ownership structure. That most of our most rapacious corporations are controlled in one way or another by private equity firms that are simply in business to figure out how they can strip as much money out of the economy as possible while doing the least possible contribution to anything of value. And so it's absolute requirement every time we ask that kind of question and deal with examples of good or bad corporate activity, take a look at how is the ownership structured, because that's another aspect of the institutional changes we have to navigate.
Thank you, David. Ellen, I'll give you one last word on this one before we move to the last section. Go ahead.
Okay, besides how we have been structuring education, right now we've got this issue of social distancing. I mean, the very term that we have to keep our distance from other people. We've got masks on, so for children, they can't recognize, you know, your expression. So even if you are reacting, they can't really tell. And I can remember as a child, I mean, we just ran around and played ball on the vacant lot and climbed in the bushes and different things. And now it's not really safe to let your child go run around the neighborhood. So everybody is very isolated, and we're in a very artificial situation where kids are learning on a screen, very artificial.
Yeah, thanks, Ellen. Okay, so with that, we're going to move into the third round discussion. And the general theme of this third round is getting out of our functional silos. So a healthy body and healthy ecosystems are fully interdependent, and their functions are inherently integrated to ensure the vibrancy of the whole. No doubt that each presenter in this conference, and certainly each of you in this discussion, is contributing in accordance with all of our abilities and our genius to human evolution in our respective fields. Yet as a collective, are we deeply enough integrated to support advancement of our highest human possibility? How do we best and most efficiently use our energy to both advance the work in our respective fields and strengthen the connections among us to ensure the vibrancy of humanity as an interdependent whole? And maybe Ellen, I'll start with you on that one. If you've got a...
Okay, well, the internet has certainly done amazing things in that respect. I mean, it can be used as a tool for ill, but it can also be used for a tool for good. It's amazing how you can really research and find answers to most things. But I think what we need now is to get rid of censorship for one, or, you know, we have too much censorship on science. Or we need to get back to our original principles, which was free speech, freedom of assembly, and freedom of religion. Today, we kind of have the science of religion, but we don't allow multiple science religions to be out there. So I think the internet is a great tool for connection, but we need to free up some of the rules on the internet, including censorship, and maybe get some you know, we need to do a few lawsuits to get back to our original constitutional Bill of Rights.
Any responses to Ellen's thoughts?
I'll say, I appreciate what Ellen is saying, and I feel there is a definite problem with the internet. I was put in Facebook jail for 2 weeks for trying to share an article about what some doctors were saying about the dangers of wearing masks all the time for people who have breathing problems, etc., headaches that were caused. Facebook, a note popped up saying that our fact checker says this is incorrect, and if you continue to distribute this kind of information, your distribution will be severely limited. And then for 2 weeks, they didn't let any of my group see what I was publishing online. So that is definitely something we have to deal with. But I keep remembering there was something that happened at the Religions for Peace conference that has stuck in my mind. A Sikh representative stood up and he held up his hand and he said, you know, everybody thinks that whatever they're working on, whether it's refugees, whether it's money problems in the world, whether it's the climate, whether it's whatever it is, you all thinking of it in separate things. He said, but look, all these fingers, they meet at the wrist. This is all part of the same thing. These are not individual issues that we have to talk about. This is about understanding that we are a collective, and these problems are collective problems that are related to each other as well. And so being, you know, we are in our silos because we found something that we love to do, and so we get to be experts in it, and we talk about it, and we read about it, and so forth. But the danger of that, of course, is that you become like, you know, the inner ear doctor. And then, of course, if there's a problem with the outer ear, you can't even talk about it. And it happens in medicine all the time, the specification, you know, how doctors become specialists and they're no longer generalists and they no longer see the whole body. They only see the part, the organ that they're dealing with. So I think that we have to be looking at what's going on in the world today as interrelated problems that we solve collectively. And if we do that, if we each move out of our comfort zone of doing just what we are familiar with and fluent with, and we're willing to listen, go to other people's talks about subjects that we ordinarily don't think about, but that are crucial, that we're going to develop what is lacking in our school system, which is interdisciplinary study. It's the interdisciplinary study that gives us the entire, how should I say, the breadth and width and depth of the world. And if we're just doing all these separate subjects, you know, I have algebra at 9, I have, you know, civics at 10, I have studying Spanish, but has anybody ever seen the book which shows the history of the world, of what's happening in every part of the world during the same decade? And you start to see, you actually start to understand why certain things were created and how they developed and how they morphed and evolved into something that we have today. But it didn't come on its own. It was also a byproduct of different people doing interdisciplinary kind of work. So my answer to that is that it's not one. It's like all of it together all the time.
Yeah, Paul. Hope you're on mute, Paul.
Thank you for those points, insights, Ellen and Ruth. And I want to also referring back to Stephen's question about what we can do, I want to use a term from the military science called, you probably heard this term before, it's called force multiplier. And the military has an idea of several force multipliers. One is education and training, that if you receive the right training, you can have 10 times the impact that you could otherwise. And I've trained with several colleagues of Martin Luther King Jr., civil rights leaders such as Bernard Lafayette, C.T. Vivian, who passed away recently, and James Lawson. And the civil rights movement's focus on training and education was to create this force multiplier where the activists would have far more impact than they would otherwise. So training education would be one force multiplier. Another one would be strategy. That if you have a strategic approach, if you become more strategic in your actions and your thinking, you can actually magnify your impact. And so strategy is another force multiplier where we have to use more strategy and become more strategic to be more effective during this urgent era of human history. And another one would be technology is also a force multiplier. And to refer back to virtual reality and augmented reality, VR and AR will be a force multiplier for injustice, but it can also be a force multiplier for justice. We can leverage the technology in our own ways to magnify our impact for creating a more peaceful and just world. And then the fourth one I'll mention is what the military calls combined arms operations. So combined arms operations is similar to what Ruth talked about in terms of interdisciplinary collaboration, where if different groups collaborate in new ways, you can also generate a kind of force multiplier that you would not otherwise have.
Thank you, Paul.
Well, I jump on the analogy bandwagon here, or the metaphor bandwagon. One of the ones that we use in the Millennium Project. For those of you who don't know, we have these nodes all around the world, 67 of them. One is in Israel, one is in Iran, one is in Armenia, one is in Azerbaijan. So we really have different kinds of players in the game, and each of these nodes are a mix of players as well. And the metaphor we try to work off of when someone wants to create a node somewhere says, think of an opera. You don't want to have just a whole mess of violins. You don't want to have just a bunch of writers. Think of the intersection of networks as a node, which gives you more richness than just a network by itself to collect as well as to disseminate. It's the global local sort of mechanism. And the opera, I've found, has been our best metaphor because people understand it's a waste of time trying to convince a trumpet to be a violin. It's just not going to work. The issue is, how does the violin and the trumpet work together for an opera? And one of the things that hit me when I was in a band eons ago, when we had to go up to the center for the orchestra music, it hit me. You're walking up there, you want that violin to really be perfect. And it's hard to be in situations in this world the way we're structured right now, where you want the other to be perfect. Right now we got a situation where you want the other to drop the ball so you can pick up the ball and run somewhere else, right? But opera is a good metaphor that I found works quite well, because it's very hard to say, well, now you have to be this way. No, you have to figure out how the relationship, I think it was Dave was talking about, the relationship is key here. And that's what old Bucky Fuller was teaching us about synergy. It's the relationship of the wheel and the box that makes the wheelbarrow.
I love that analogy of you want your other players to be perfect. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Total opposite of competition.
Yeah.
Yeah, Ellen.
I just watched the movie Ants with Woody Allen. It's a cartoon, but I just thought it was brilliant. And that what defined humanity, or anthood, I guess, was individuality, to think for yourself. And yet, obviously the teamwork built amazing things. I mean, you need the combination of teamwork and not being overrun by the dominator, whatever force, but think for yourself and work with the team. I don't know. I just was really impressed with that movie. It seemed like it was what was going on today. We've got a dominator force that's trying to drown the whole ant colony, like in the movie. But, or another one I liked was Oh, never mind. I can't think of the word.
This reminds me, because I think it was in your keynote, David, and you may have mentioned in your opening remarks as well, is that actually the humanity, we've been encoded to cooperate, and it was over time that we got whatever had happened that we unlearned it.
Yeah.
So like it's built into us originally anyway.
Well, how do you figure? How are we encoded?
This goes to the heart of Rianne's work. In terms of the historical dynamic, that when we moved away from, well, first of all, we moved from being hunter-gatherers, where we were totally embedded in the natural living systems, to becoming farmers. So then we began to control nature. That was a period about 5,000 years. Most of that time, we also still organized as communities of relative equality. But then we began to move to monarchies and the hierarchy, the pyramids of power, where the people on the top then were increasingly exploiting the people who were working the land and providing the food. And of course, that further evolved when we got into the course of modern development. Part of the explicit strategy was to move people off of the land entirely, so they were forced into jobs, working for some corporation or working as itinerant farmers or doing anything where they were selling their labor cheap to the people who actually controlled the economy. And so that goes right to the heart of everything that we must accomplish now of coming back. And I'm just so taken. I had never thought of that opera analogy before. But I would also throw in a refinement on that. The opera is totally pre-planned. It is not a creative process, even though it is.
Okay, jazz. We'll go to jazz.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Jazz is closer to what we're talking about. Mm-hmm. And particularly, what's the name? The African American jazz, the
blues.
Pardon?
Blues? You say about the blues or what?
No, there's a specific name for it, but it's it's a very, very creative jazz where people are taking off and expressing their individuality in all kinds of ways, but it's all
that's improvisation. Well, improvisation isn't necessarily African, but improvisation is maybe what you're talking about.
That would be it's certainly a form of.
I wanted to ask Peter a question about this issue. Is that okay? Can we?
Sure. Yeah, well, please go ahead.
So Peter, architects, filmmakers, they're auteurs. They have a vision. They have an idea. Very often they can build housing for an entire community, but it's based on their individual vision and things that they've absorbed from other architects that they love and admire and studied, right? So has there been any movement among the architects to get together as a collective?
Charrettes. Charrette came out of, it came out of architecture. Peter, you know about charrettes in architecture, yes?
Yeah, the term charrette means wheelbarrow in French, and it's from the era of King Louis XIV.
Little cart. It means little cart.
You would be locked away for a few days, make your project, then the cart would come by and you'd throw your project in to be reviewed.
And then you'd be in the cart because you didn't finish your homework, and you had to stop at the inn because you had to kick back the other students. So you're going around. So the innkeeper would say, "Hey, well, you need a little red on that one over there. You need a little green over there." So a charrette design evolved, as you're pointing out, from the French school of art, of drawings and design to the idea in the United States is used quite a bit, where you bring together, those are the 15 elements of the problem, and what is the knowledge and experience of pacemakers of each of those together, and you stick them into several days and say, you got to come out with a design at the end. And if you don't come out with a design at the end, you're all failed. And so architecture I give architecture, it has been taken out of architecture for urban planning now.
Yeah, and I would add,
the story about the Getty, about Gary, and he had a huge fight with the landscape designer, and they didn't talk to each other. I mean, it's like two people with separate visions. They're working on the same the same grand project, right? And they have to be integrated, the two, because the building and the landscape are two parts of it. And yet they couldn't get along. They couldn't talk to each other. So I'm saying, what do you see? Do you see anything new happening in your field in America or elsewhere?
Well, I don't know. I can speak for myself personally. You know, what I've been developing, I need an Ellen Brown, and I need a Ruth, and I need Paul. I need people that are not related to architecture to help me build these communities. And I keep saying that the community builds the community. You know, so maybe it's less about architects working with other architects, and maybe architects working with a financial person and a peacemaker, and you know, I think that's the way forward. Yeah.
Like that.
Beautiful. You know, just to draw out that analogy about improv a little bit, you know, it's that yes and idea, that whatever's been presented or offered is, like you say yes to it, and you build on it. There's actually no time to go back and judge or argue it. You just continue moving forward, and it seems like a really elegant way to you know, Jerome, like you said, it's the intersection of the nodes. It's a yes, and what do we do with that, rather than trying to overanalyze it or somehow break it down into something that causes us to not do it. Yeah. Ellen, you had your hand up.
Well, I was just going to say, I thought of the other movie I was thinking of, The Hunger Games, which is like 1984, you know, where you've got a television system that's basically controlling everyone, or maybe an internet system. But the good team, you know, the people win in the end by taking that same technology and turning it against the dominator group. Well, so that's what it seems to me, that what we need to do is capture this thing that we're afraid is about to run us over, and make sure that it's got the public interest built into it, and, you know, all those values, that religious and constitutional, that our forefathers fought for, et cetera, that we consider American. I've seen it said that Americans are considered the biggest threat because we think for ourselves. But that's what we have to do. We, like everybody would say, we need to think for ourselves, but in a cooperative, group-minded sort of way, recognizing that we're all part of an integrated whole.
We're coming up on about 6 or 7 minutes left, and I guess just as a way of closing, maybe go around the table and just get some concluding summary comments from you all, and maybe you could start that with Peter.
Yeah, I think that all of the things that we're talking about as problems, you know, I like to say, instead of problem solving, I say solution finding, because I love just switching that mental way we're looking at it to a positive. And I know from my work, that's how I found all of my solutions, is just to switch from problem to solutions.
Yeah, thanks. It's certainly in alignment with the spirit of this conference. So thank you, Peter. Paul.
Yeah, I think just people need to become as well trained in waging peace as soldiers are in waging war. And we have to develop our humanity and learn who we are as humans, and learn the art of living. And the urgency has never been greater. And I'm just really grateful for all of your important work, and very grateful to be here with all of you. And if people would like to learn more, peaceliteracy.org. Can learn more about peace.
Thank you, Paul. I appreciate it. Ruth.
Well, I'd like to refer to a religious quote that God does not give us anything that we can't handle, and that we are maybe stretching ourselves to what we think are our limitations. But David's point about developing our consciousness is going to be the key to resolving these problems we have, and I have faith in us. I have faith in all of us, and I appreciate each and every one of you here today, and the things that you're doing in the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Jerry.
Well, building on the consciousness, that's the mystic side of the house. I don't mean religion, but mystic side of the house. and then the technocrat. Each one thinks they're the answer to whatever it is, right? So imagine putting the mystic and technocrat into a yin-yang, one creating the other, creating the other. So you design technology to enhance consciousness, and from an enhanced consciousness, you design technology. And I think that we are all part mystic and technocrats. We got to make peace among ourselves and also in society. So rather than saying the technocrats are right or the mystics are right, it says, you know, put it into a yin-yang, yourself as well as in society. Like when a person plays a piano, is it the piano? Is it the music? Is it the consciousness? It's the whole thing together.
Yeah, Jerry.
I'll have what he's having.
Jerry, you remind me of one of Barbara's revelations was about it was taking our spiritual capacities with technology to consciously evolve. So thank you. Ellen.
Well, I graduated from Berkeley in the 1960s, so I was big on this Age of Aquarius. I loved all those paintings, you know, the Age of Aquarius type paintings. So the Age of Aquarius officially starts December 21st. And, you know, I've seen it said that these are the birth pangs of a new era. And so we need to, and I have always felt fortunate to be on the cusp. Crises are when things change. You need to break up the old before you can bring in the new. And we know there are forces trying to bring in a new that is even more controlling. But this is our opportunity to turn that around into something that really serves the public interest. And I know we are all working on ways that we could design the system in a way that it does serve everyone. We certainly have the resources to feed everyone and, you know, to have a fair society. And it's just a matter of distribution. And I know money's not everything, but it's definitely a system that we have to work with and always have worked with. So that's my particular angle, but everybody's got their angle. But anyway, I like to feel positive. Like, I mean, it is hard in this isolated environment to keep up your attitude, but it does seem to me that we're right on the cusp of hopefully something much bigger and better and wonderful.
Yeah, thank you, Ellen. And then David.
Yeah. Well, I keep coming back to a foundational realization that where we need to go in our current situation is where no human has ever been before. And what that means is that anyone who thinks they have the solution doesn't understand the problem. And that finding the solution, as I think we've all been agreeing very much, depends on our coming together and sharing our understanding and wisdom in ways, again, that, well, we've never been able to do as a global species before. We now have the technology to begin to do that. And we've got to recognize this also in terms of one of the immediate things that we've got to get over is that because there is this deep and growing awareness that things are going very badly, and this cuts across right and left, that both sides are working basically out of deep fear. And it's a very well-grounded fear. But the fear tends to turn us against each other, whereas the solution depends on working together, grounded in a common recognition that we either survive together or we are going to perish together, the most fundamental way. And so that I think is a foundational piece of our conversation. How do we shift that conversation in a way that shifts the focus of society as a whole from the fear and the danger, which is very real, to the possibilities that we possess as a species to create a very different future. But it has to be based on foundationally different relationships than we now organize around. And that requires deep change in our institutions. It means getting totally beyond certain things like war And also, I would suggest away from transnational for-profit corporations, which are totally obsolete institutions, along with monarchy and emperors. So the challenges are huge, and I thank you all for this conversation, because I think we've touched on many elements of the future that we need to create together, and hopefully this webinar will be useful in advancing that understanding and learning.
Yeah. Thank you so much, David. It's been my honor and pleasure to work with you in organizing this panel tonight. And thank you all for your generative contributions. David, Ellen, Jerome, Ruth, Paul, and Peter. And I just look forward to continuing to ally with you all as we continue the good work. So thanks very much. And thank you all for watching. And be well until we see you again. Bye-bye.
Be safe.
Bye.
Peace.